Hi, we're back, and we are going to start in with a lecture series called Skills from First Year Chemistry, and I'm going to shorten that to SFFYC on my further notes. And so I'll call this one Skills from First Year Chemistry 101, and this is regarding nomenclature of different chemical compounds. So we want to first understand that there are three kinds of chemical compounds that we learn to name in chemistry. So there's three kinds of substances. And we want to work on being able to recognize those substances based on either their name or their formula. And so I'm just going to give you an overview here first to start with. And one of the three are covalent substances. And then we have ionic substances and acidic substances. Okay, so there's covalent, ionic, and acidic. And the way that you can tell these two or these three different substances apart is to look and see what they're composed of. So covalent substances are going to be made up of nonmetals only. And ionic substances are going to be made of ions, amazingly enough. These are generally a metal plus a nonmetal. And then acidic substances, the easiest way to recognize them is that these will start with a hydrogen in their formula, or they'll have acid in their name. Okay, so we have covalent, ionic, and acidic substances. We're going to start off with covalent substances in this little lecture, and then we'll go on to ionic and then acidic. And that'll all be under nomenclature, which will be in 101, Skills from First Year Chemistry 101. Okay. So what we want to do first is look at covalent substances. And remember, these are substances that are made up only of nonmetals. That's probably the easiest way to recognize them. And remember that nonmetals are the small part of the periodic table to the right of your staircase that we drew last year. Okay, so with covalent substances, you use prefixes to tell how many of each element is in the substance. So that's one rule. Always use prefixes to tell how many of each element is in the substance. And then the second rule is that the last element in the name will always end in IDE. So if it's oxygen, it would end in oxide. If it was hydrogen, it would end in hydride. Sulfur, it would end in sulfide. And then our last thing that we want to remember is that we never lead with mono as a prefix. Even if the substance is by itself, you never lead with mono. And I'll get into that here in just a minute when we do some examples. So let's say, for instance, that we're trying to name something or come up with the formula based on the name. And so what we're going to do is just make a little table Name and, I'm gonna wipe that out, sorry. So we're gonna have name and formula. And we'll just work through a couple of examples based on these three rules for covalent substances. Okay, so let's say that we have a name of sulfur dioxide. Oops, I'm off the page there. Sulfur dioxide. So we would know that sulfur is by itself and di is the prefix for 2. So we would have a formula of SO2. Now these prefixes need to be listed for us so that we know what the prefixes are, and we'll just do the prefixes for 1 through 10. So if there is a, we'll just do a little prefix list here. If there is a single atom, or one atom of a substance, then you use the prefix mono, but you never lead with it. That would only be at the middle or the end of a name. If there's 2 atoms, you use the prefix di. If there's 3, you use the prefix tri. If there are 4, you would maybe think that it's quad, but it's not. You use the prefix tetra, kind of like Tetris, and 5 is penta, 6 is hexa, 7 is hepta, 8 is octa, like octagon or octopus, you can remember that too. 9 is nona, and 10 is deca, like a decade. So these are all prefixes that we use to indicate how many of a specific element there are in a substance. So we're going to go on with a couple more examples, and you can take time to memorize these, definitely, so that you have them in your bag of tricks right at the top of your head. And we'll do a couple more examples here on the next page. And that's kind of spotty, so I'm going to flip that over. Okay, so these are some more examples continued. And we'll have our name column here and our formula column here. And let's say that we're going to start with a formula this time, and we'll say that that formula is CO2. Now, we have a singular carbon here, but remember that we never lead with the prefix mono. So in the name, we would just call that carbon. And then we would look and see here that there's 2 oxygens, so that would be dioxide. Because remember that the last element always ends in IDE. Okay, let's try another example. Let's try S2O3. And notice this does not have a charge, it's a neutral substance, and so we don't name it as an ion, we name it as a covalent substance. So there are 2 sulfurs here, so we would call this disulfur, and there's 3 oxygens here, so we would call this trioxide. Okay, pretty simple, so you just remember you use prefixes. Last element ends in IDE, and you never lead with mono. We're going to do one more that's a little bit more challenging. So we'll try, let me keep my colors consistent here, C2H5Br. So that's an example of a substance that's made of 3 different elements, and we're just going to go through and name it using our rules. So we have 2 carbons here, So that's going to be dicarbon. And then 5 hydrogens is going to be pentahydrogen. And then 1 bromine. This would all be on the same line if I had enough space. This is going to be monobromide. Now remember, we're not leading with the mono, but the mono's in the middle or the end of a name is okay. So that's covalent substances for nomenclature. And just remember the 3 rules. Always use a prefix. Okay, so you ready? Always use a prefix, and if the last element ends in IDE, and you never lead with mono.